Good morning, everybody. We will be joined in a few moments by Senator Merkley, who was on the Senate side, of course, and we'll be here for his opening. We're going to delay a little bit, but we do have two panels, and as soon as he does come, obviously I will recognize the distinguished senator and co-chair. Today's hearing, corporate complicity subsidizing the PRC's human rights violations, will come to order. Since the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, and for some even before that date, far too many elite leaders of America's most profitable corporations and like-minded government enablers here and around the world have embraced and welcomed the Chinese Communist Party with open arms. The predictably false hope that robust trade would somehow help China matriculate from a dictatorship to a functioning democracy had no compelling precedent in history, especially a country that's owned lock, stock, and barrel by force by a brutal communist party. That false hope has been further exposed every single year since the early 1990s by China's ever-worsening abuse and violence against its own citizens. The pervasive use of government-sanctioned genocide, torture, rape, forced abortion, involuntary sterilization, forced organ harvesting, human sex and labor trafficking, religious persecution, kangaroo courts, particularly for political and religious prisoners, free speech and assembly violations, the atrocities they have committed in Hong Kong after making solemn promises to protect the basic rights, as well as the Sino-UK agreement. And of course, there's so many other crimes against humanity. They attest to an absolutely shameful record of wanton cruelty. Tragically, the abuse and violence has only gotten worse under Xi Jinping. You know, with his famous executive order of May 26, 1994, President Clinton abolished the requirement that the Chinese Communist Party achieve, quote, significant progress, close quote, in protecting human rights as the condition for extending most favored nation status, in other words, the elimination of import tariffs by the United States. A few months earlier in 1994, before the President Clinton's capitulation, I traveled to Beijing and met with foreign ministry officials in Beijing and argued that President Clinton wasn't going to back down or back off his promise to end MFN unless China reformed its barbaric practices. I even conveyed to the CCP officials a bipartisan letter signed by 100 members of Congress, left and right. Nancy Pelosi was on that. Frank Wolf was a co-signer, and many others. And we said, we stand with President Clinton, and we stand for human rights. While there, I also met with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, who thought that we were wrong to link MFN with human rights. After a spirited exchange over breakfast, I came away with the inescapable conclusion that no human rights violation by the CCP would be caused to disrupt lucrative business deals. A few months later, to my shock and dismay, President Clinton delinked human rights from trade. He did it on a Friday afternoon after almost everybody in this building had left to go back to their districts. I was lingering doing some work in the office when the story hit. I ran over to the press gallery, did a press conference impromptu. If you go to C-SPAN, you can see it. I wasn't the only one. Nancy Pelosi ended up doing her own press conference. We were shocked that he delinked. He had accused, and rightfully, President George Herbert Walker Bush of coddling dictatorship, and I agreed with that. After Tiananmen Square, then he coddled like no other. The symbiotic U.S.-China trading relationship that emerged in the 1990s and continues to this day allowed many to become incredibly rich and powerful while conveying to the CCP extraordinary industrial capacity and know-how for both consumer goods and, ominously, military products and capability. That CCP military capability today poses an existential threat to Taiwan, numerous nations in the region, and to the United States of America ourselves. Today, it is deeply discouraged to see that the ongoing complicity of American companies in aiding and abetting the Chinese Communist Party's heinous crimes against humanity and genocide. Many are complicit in concealing the PRC's abuses. Many are complicit in the PRC's restrictions on freedoms. Many are even complicit in amplifying the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda across our country, spreading political and ideological stances that are completely contrary, antithetical to what the United States stands for. American companies and consumers should not be subsidizing tyranny. In January, I reintroduced the China Trade Relations Act of 2023 to end MFN, now called Normal Trade Relations, to China. Actually, it's almost a carbon copy of what we were talking about in 1994 and 1993, when President Clinton, to all of our great positive, I did press conference after press conference, thanking him for linking human rights to trade, only 1 year later to see that he delinked it. One of our distinguished witnesses today, and we have every single person here testifying, has done an enormous amount of work and provided leadership, and we're so grateful that you're here. One of our distinguished witnesses today has paid an enormous price, the loss of his amazing 11-year basketball career in the NBA, for his courageous stand for human rights, especially for the Uyghurs, the victims of Xi Jinping's ongoing genocide. He will testify today that after he got released, about 3 weeks later, released means fired, of course, China put the games that had been barred from Chinese TV because he wore basketball shoes that said, "Free the Uyghurs," back on television. ESPN did an investigation and found out that some 49 NBA owners have $10 billion tied up in China. Money talks, and human rights go right out the window. The Chinese Communist Party ordered the NBA to fire Enes Kanter Freedom, and like cowards, they obeyed. I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, the co-chair of our commission, Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. It's good to have you with us. I'm glad we're continuing to dig into the issue of corporations' connection to the Chinese Communist Party's human rights abuses in China and elsewhere. This has been an intense interest, a bipartisan and bicameral interest of this commission. With so many of the issues that we monitor, the CCP's abuses are sometimes amplified or even abetted by the actions of actors closer to home. When products from cotton to car parts are made on the backs of Uyghur slave labor, companies seeking to get those products into the U.S. market subsidize the economic machinery of genocide. When authorities crush Hong Kong's cherished freedoms, they count on multinational corporations to continue business as usual. When mass surveillance and biometric data collection target repressed populations, some American companies provide the technology, the services, or the data that bolster the surveillance state. Our commissioners have taken an interest in these issues because it's unacceptable to us if any American business props up genocide, enables censorship, or legitimizes actions that trample on basic universal freedoms. That's why last Congress, I chaired hearings focused on the message leading American companies were sending by lending their prestige to the 2022 Beijing Olympics. And we focused on the way the PRC leverages technology for deeply repressive purposes, and the coercive economic dynamics that too often lead companies to self-censor or even parrot propaganda. We sent letters to some of the most respected brands in America when their actions put them at risk of complicity with human rights abuses. Companies like Apple, Hilton, Amazon, Airbnb, NBC, the NBA, and more. This commission's signature initiative to guard against corporate complicity has been the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Representative McGovern, Senator Rubio, Representative Smith, and I spearheaded that legislation to protect American consumers and to hold corporations trading in the products of forced labor accountable. At our April hearing, we heard from experts about the initial implementation of this law and the difficult road ahead to make sure we enforce it effectively. I'm grateful that Undersecretary Silvers, the chair of the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, is with us today to help us grapple with those challenges. As we heard at the April hearing, businesses should now consider themselves on notice that protecting their supply chains from being tainted by forced labor must be a top-tier issue of corporate compliance, because it is for the U.S. government. But that's only the start of the paradigm shift that we need. We need businesses across the economy to diversify their supply chains to be less susceptible to Chinese coercion, to avoid complicity with human rights abuses. We need greater transparency about businesses' data practices, exposure to the pressures coming from China, and more. And defenders of freedom need to speak out so businesses know that there will be reputational costs for abetting human rights abuses. Thank you to all of our witnesses for your role in speaking out, and I appreciate you sharing your expertise and personal stories with us, and I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you so very much, Senator Merkley. We're joined by Commissioner Salinas. Thank you. I yield to you.
I have no comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I've been advised Jennifer Wexton, another commissioner, is online, and I yield the floor to her.
Okay, I think we can go back to her.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let me introduce our first witness, and when Jennifer comes back, we'll ask her for any opening comments she might have. With the one-year anniversary of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act's implementation just last month, we're grateful to welcome the Honorable Robert Silvers, Undersecretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Undersecretary Silvers is responsible for driving policy and implementation plans across all of DHS's missions and enforcing all forced labor laws under its purview. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, drafted and spearheaded by this commission, is one of the most important pieces of legislation passed by the Congress in the last 2 decades. As I expressed at our hearing just a few months ago, it is my hope that the legislation will prick the consciences of corporate actors, and that it will be my further hope that companies will determine that the bottom line concerns will motivate them to do the right thing. And indeed, I believe there are shared hopes of all of us today. Undersecretary Silvers, as chair of the Interagency Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, is making an incredible impact on eliminating forced labor from tainting U.S. and global supply chains. When our commission wrote to him about our concerns about the implementation, he echoed our sentiments and detailed his plans on how the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force will continue expanding the entity list and fine-tuning its important efforts to best hold violators accountable. Thank you, Undersecretary Silvers, for joining us today. And on behalf of our entire commission, I welcome you and look forward to your testimony and yield you such time as you may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Merkley, and distinguished commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the work of the Department of Homeland Security and the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force to combat forced labor in global supply chains. The U.S. has long condemned the People's Republic of China's ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs and other minority groups, including the systemic use of forced labor. U.S. laws that prohibit importation of these illicit goods reflect our values. They honor human rights. They protect American workers and legitimate businesses. At DHS, we are proud to enforce our nation's forced labor laws. It is the right thing to do. Congress charged the task force with leveraging the authorities of our member agencies across the executive branch to ensure the U.S. government is doing everything in its power to eradicate forced labor. I am honored to chair the task force, and under the leadership of Secretary Mayorkas, we are facilitating the flow of legitimate trade while working across the public and private sectors to keep goods made with forced labor out of U.S. commerce. We applaud the commitment of the Commission and members of Congress who, on a bipartisan basis, secured the passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or the UFLPA. This law has brought a sea change to the way we approach the eradication of forced labor. Our implementation of the UFLPA has been speedy, strong, and surgical. Speedy because we implemented ahead of the aggressive schedule required by the law. Strong because we devote the full weight of our resources to enforcing the law. And surgical because our enforcement is based on risk assessment, intelligence, and data-driven targeting. Since the UFLPA took effect in June of 2022, Customs and Border Protection has targeted more than 4,200 shipments, valued at over $1.4 billion, sending a clear message to importers that we take our mandate seriously. We continue to improve our operations with innovative technology, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, and scientific testing that can help us determine the true origin of goods. Our early enforcement has been strong, but we do face challenges, including the risks posed by de minimis shipments and the need for further resources to fulfill our mandate. We welcome the opportunity to work with this commission and Congress to address these challenges together in a bipartisan way. In addition to the rebuttable presumption that the UFLPA established for goods coming from Xinjiang province, the UFLPA has other important components, including the public identification of illicit actors through the UFLPA entity list. The task force is committed to expanding the UFLPA entity list, as demonstrated by the recent addition of 2 new entities, extending the list to a current total of 22 entities. There is an active pipeline of referrals we are examining, and we anticipate more additions to the list in the coming months. Our partnership with the NGO community is critical, as is their research and monitoring efforts to identify forced labor schemes. Our engagements with the trade community focus on ensuring they have information and guidance to support their compliance efforts, including best practices for supply chain tracing and risk management, and statistics on our enforcement from CBP's digital dashboard. We engage industry leaders, including C-suite executives and board directors, to emphasize that eradicating forced labor from their supply chains must be a top-tier compliance issue. They must address this issue with the same vigilance that they address foreign corrupt practices, export controls, sanctions, privacy, anti-money laundering laws, and other pillars of modern corporate compliance. We are still in the early stages of quantifying the impact of the UFLPA on private sector behavior, but early data show promise. One respected supply chain mapping company, Altana AI, reports that transactions from entities potentially subject to enforcement under the law decreased by approximately 40% between June 2022 and March 2023. The same period also saw the overall value of transactions decrease by approximately 50%. Another supply chain mapping company, Sayari, has informed us that it has similar data. We are seeing similar trends from other providers, and these all support extensive anecdotal reporting that industry is taking UFLPA compliance seriously and taking steps to ensure it comes into line with the law's requirements. The UFLPA is a testament to the impact that Congress and the executive branch can have when they work together. This new enforcement regime is a significant step towards justice, accountability, and fair competition. There is much more work to do, and we are all in on this mission. I thank the Commission and Congress for their support in the fight against forced labor. Thank you for the opportunity to appear. I look forward to taking your questions this morning.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Undersecretary, for your testimony and again for the work that you're doing each and every day. Let me ask you, at our hearing, pardon me, at our hearing just a few weeks ago, we heard some very disturbing testimony about the de minimis loophole, which you mentioned in your testimony, that so much could be coming into the U.S. from Xinjiang that goes undetected, and an $800 threshold. How do you know when you're not even checking? I'm not saying you, but how do we know when we're not checking packages coming in because there's an assumption that it is part of the de minimis? One estimate was that there's 3 million packages a day coming. I thought that was very high. I don't know if that's accurate, but that came out of that hearing. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what we should be doing to maybe close that loophole, do a more robust checking of those packages, because it seems to me if the Chinese Communist Party can find a way to skirt any kind of, and the businesses that are working there, any kind of sanctions, they will do it, and they're masters at that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I share your concerns and your questions about the effect of the de minimis exception and what it means for our forced labor enforcement. To be clear, the UFLPA does apply to de minimis shipments. We conduct our risk-based targeting and our other approaches on de minimis shipments. However, there are challenges. We get less data for de minimis shipments than we do for shipments valued at over $800, and that makes the targeting and the enforcement work more difficult. We do receive into this country somewhere between 2 and 3 million de minimis shipments per day.
Per day.
And so the numbers I've heard are something around 700 million or so per year. And it is an extremely high volume. Recognizing, and this is, I should note, this doesn't just challenge our enforcement as to our forced labor laws, it challenges our enforcement to a whole host of important issues. Our ability to detect narcotics that may be shipped in, fentanyl, other contraband, counterfeit items, and products made with forced labor. Recognizing the challenges, I have worked very closely together with the terrific team at Customs and Border Protection to develop short, medium, and long-term strategies to work on this issue. In the short term, we are adopting software enhancements that will improve our ability to target on de minimis shipments and enforce our laws. In the medium term, we are looking at regulatory changes that can enhance our data collection. And in the long term, we would like to work with Congress. You're going to be hearing a lot over the coming months about what we are calling our 21st century customs framework. This is an attempt to modernize the way we process cargo into this country so that it is both efficient and has integrity and security. And we would like to work with Congress on those issues because it will have a lot of positive impact for our ability to enforce forced labor laws, including in the de minimis environment.
Secretary, about a year ago, I chaired a hearing on the outrageous practice by the Chinese Communist Party of exploiting children in the DR Congo. They have pretty much captured the entirety of the cobalt mining. Something on the order of 35,000 to 40,000 children are being exploited every day, and maybe upwards of 200,000 adults. When those mines were owned by United States companies, arguably they were better in terms of their treatment, their payment of salaries, and more humane conditions, but that has all gone the wrong way with Chinese leadership. Now, we were told at that hearing, and I introduced a bill just a few weeks ago, that would look to enforce our trade sanctions against forced labor and child labor, whether they find themselves in an EV or for some other purpose, which cobalt obviously has multiple purposes. And I'm wondering your thoughts on that. The bill, I think, is an idea whose time has come. How dare we build cars, whether it be Tesla or any others, with child labor, kids who are dying. And what came through with that hearing, and we have followed up very vigorously, the DR Congo leadership, it would seem, is just simply looking the other way or getting paid off by the Chinese Communist Party. We know there's no Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, so that's a very easy thing to do. So all this cobalt is going to China. It's being refined and then put into use in EVs and in other applications. And I'm just wondering what your sense is about that. We'll send you the bill. I hope you'll take a look at it and give us any thoughts you might have on it. But I see Teslas all over the road. I mean, especially in this area. And every time I see one now, I say, that was built on the backs of some African child or some African adult who may be dead now, certainly often sick, and many of them do die in those mines or from sicknesses garnered from breathing in those vapors or that dust. Your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are going to enforce our forced labor laws wherever the facts lead, whether they lead to China or whether they lead to other countries where China may be exporting its forced labor practices. And no place or industry or supply chain is off the table when it comes to our zero tolerance approach for forced labor. I would look forward to reviewing the bill and working with you on the issue.
Can I just ask finally, then I'll yield to my distinguished colleagues, what is being done by DHS to address the use of prison labor at the Shizhan prison, where a supplier for Milwaukee Tool employs political prisoners for labor, making them work some 7 days a week, 13 hours a day to meet their quotas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are quite concerned about the significant amount of reporting that we receive about abusive labor practices in PRC prisons. We have our Homeland Security Investigations Agency, including through their presence at our embassy in Beijing, investigate and look into those kinds of issues. And if there is a link found between forced labor in Chinese prisons and product that is to be shipped to the United States, we will fully enforce. I will say it is difficult work because it is so difficult to get facts about what is happening on the ground in China, not least of all within a Chinese prison. The lack of transparency into the Chinese system is a challenge that we have to penetrate. It's a challenge that companies that want to do the right thing have to penetrate because it makes due diligence difficult. I think that's part of the reason why you've seen a number of companies working to pull their supply chains out where they cannot obtain the transparency that they need and that the law that you passed requires.
I appreciate that. Without objection, I ask unanimous consent that a letter by Senator Merkley and I be included in the record. It's a letter to Steve Richmond, who's the president of Milwaukee Tool. We lay out the problem as we see it, particularly since Wisconsin Watch did an investigative report on this, and the findings are very, very damaging. And Milwaukee Tool gloves continue to be sold at Home Depot, and as well as on Amazon. And we need to get to the bottom of it. So without objection, this will become part of the record. Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Undersecretary, I'll try to be brief in my questions because I have a lot of them, and if you can be succinct in your responses, it would be helpful. First, we see that a lot of shipments that are being questioned are really being shipped through Malaysia and Vietnam. Are you getting cooperation from the governments of Malaysia and Vietnam?
We are. We engage with both those countries, and that is correct. The two countries that have the most enforced shipments under the UFLPA are actually from Vietnam and Malaysia, and it shows the distributed nature of supply chains and that things that are made in Xinjiang may end up elsewhere before being shipped to the United States, and we understand that and we enforce on it.
And I think it also reflects an effort to launder the products out of China to try to make it more difficult for the U.S. to intercept them under this bill. So I'm glad you're paying a lot of attention to that. Under the UFLPA dashboard, about 16% of the 4,200 plus shipments that were targeted were denied entry into the U.S. When they are denied entry into the U.S., is the manufacturer or the shipper able to then transport those goods to another country?
Under the law, they are, if we deny entry, they are permitted to re-export or destroy the goods.
So I just want to note that that's an area we should pay attention to, because if it simply means they're stopped in the U.S., but they're shipped across the border to Canada, we really haven't achieved much, which brings me to my next question. How much cooperation are we getting with Canada and Mexico in terms of creating a more united regime in regard to forced labor?
So, Senator, I agree 100% with you that we won't achieve our common goal of eradicating forced labor if the goods just go elsewhere. That is why we are putting such a priority on international cooperation. The USMCA trade agreement requires the U.S., Mexico, and Canada all to have forced labor enforcement regimes. We are working with both those governments towards that end.
Great. And Europe?
And we engage with European partners as well. I think there are huge benefits to harmonized laws. The UFLPA, I think the Commission can take great pride, is the most forward-looking, aggressive law in the world right now on this subject. And I've seen interest in a number of other governments in adopting similar legislation, which I think is all to the good.
So in the last year, the task force has only added 2 new companies to the entity list, and you mentioned the entity list. Are there roadblocks to expanding the entity list? Why only 2?
So, Senator, we did add 2 very recently. There's now a total of 22 that were listed in the first year of enforcement, though the first 20 came much earlier in the enforcement period. We are placing a very high priority on populating the entity list. When the new law was passed, it did not come with resources for the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. We aggressively pulled resources and people from other mission spaces we had, over the course of the months, we had to build an entirely new process for an entity list that did not exist at all. That is now up and running, and I am placing a very high priority on naming additional entities. We have a very active pipeline of cases, and more will come soon.
Do we see companies really starting to respond saying, hey, this is real. We either have to establish our safe harbor, like very clear documentation, or we need to move our production that has been tied to forced labor into a different country or a different part of China, so on and so forth. We've seen are companies starting to take this seriously?
Yes. We have significant data and significant anecdotal evidence. The companies are hearing this. The message is well received in terms of congressional intent, as well as through our strong enforcement in year one. And so, for example, the software, the AI-driven supply chain management software company Altana noted that suspicious shipments from Xinjiang or related to Xinjiang to the U.S. declined by 50% over the first year of enforcement based on its trade data.
Are we seeing a fair amount of that being bifurcated supply chains? That is, well, we have a factory in Vietnam, we'll send those products to the U.S. while sending the Xinjiang factory's products somewhere else that doesn't have this enforcement.
I think, and that goes to our prior discussion, I think there is always the risk, Senator, that goods that we won't let in, manufacturers will try to send elsewhere. That's why we place such a premium on having like-minded countries introduce similar enforcement regimes. We are also very mindful of the risk of transshipment, that is, of companies trying to obscure the provenance of goods by shipping them through third countries or shell companies. We are very attuned to that in our enforcement.
So Congress appropriated funding for innovative technology to help with enforcement, such as supply chain mapping, supply chain traceability, DNA testing. Do you have any pilot projects that have started utilizing that money? Is the rubber hitting the road?
The rubber has already hit the road, Senator. We are using several AI-based software supply chain mapping tools. We see tremendous pickup in the importing community, the private sector, of those same kinds of tools. We are also looking very closely at scientific testing, such as DNA testing, that can help determine the provenance of goods, in particular DNA testing that can tell you whether cotton comes from Xinjiang province. And we're likewise seeing uptake in the trade community. CBP hosted a technology expo a couple months back. I think I saw a number of staff members from the commission attended, and to showcase the range of technologies that can help with due diligence and supply chain visibility.
Another challenge is growing direct to consumer apps like Shein and Temu. How do you intend to handle those direct to consumer strategies?
I think this raises issues about what is happening with de minimis shipments, that is, shipments that are valued at less than $800 and which, pursuant to statute, receive an expedited process for coming into the country. Look, first, when we receive reports that any shipping channel may be infected with forced labor products, we are going to look into that and investigate and take enforcement action as appropriate. And as I was discussing with Chairman Smith earlier, we have developed strategies for addressing the challenges of UFLPA enforcement in the de minimis context, including enhanced software that we are procuring, potential regulatory and statutory changes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now yield to Commissioner Salinas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both co-chairs for this hearing today. Undersecretary Silver's goal of the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the CHIPS and Science Act, is to build up our domestic manufacturing capacity and reduce our reliance on China. This could make it far easier to avoid some of the challenges we discussed earlier around mineral supply chains. But it also makes me wonder what we might lose by building a more arm's-length economic relationship with China. Is there evidence that Chinese entities actually respond to American import restrictions by improving their labor practices?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. we do strongly support supply chain resilience initiatives such as the CHIPS Act, building up a domestic supply chain and manufacturing base for things like semiconductors that's just critical to our future. We believe we can do that while still maintaining our leverage to shape practices within China to the extent we can, but as importantly, perhaps shape the practices of importers and where they decide to source from. I think the last decades have shown that we may not have complete leverage in terms of shaping how China intends to run its system. But what we do have a lot of leverage over is what products we allow into this country. And I think what we have seen is Congress, on a bipartisan basis, pass laws like the UFLPA. And that is, we have significant reason to believe, is causing a lot of companies to pull their supply chains out of Xinjiang province. And so I think we can pursue the really important domestic supply chain and manufacturing resilience strategies that you mentioned, while also keeping enforcement strong to keep these kinds of forced labor products out of our system.
Thank you. I think we can do both as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Commissioner Wexton. Is she on?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
y'all
we
hear me
can.
okay?
Perfectly, thank you.
Good, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much, Mr. Undersecretary, for being here as well. And before I get started with my questions, I'm going to tell you I have an illness which affects how I speak, which make it kind of hard for me to speak in a way that is understandable. I'm sorry if I do that, and please do not hesitate. If I say something I have trouble understanding, please do not hesitate to let me know and ask me to repeat the question, or repeat the question yourself to make sure you got it right, okay? Do that for me, please.
I will, thank you.
Thank you so much. So I represent Virginia 10, which is a Northern Virginia district, and had until very recently one of the highest populations of Uyghur Muslims in the United States. And it's still, we have a very big population here in Northern Virginia, so it's something that's really important to a lot of my constituents. I commend the work that the DHS and Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force have been doing on this issue. I'll admit I was kind of skeptical when I got the sense that the administration was slow walking the passage of this bill. Now that it's been passed, you guys are doing a really fantastic job getting everything done. So I really appreciate that, and just thank you. So I really thank you for that and the work you've been doing, but there are methods and models for human rights due diligence. We're not seeing companies demonstrating that they know how their operations affect human rights. So it's a problem. The companies I don't know whether they actually know how their supply chains are affecting human rights, or whether they're being deliberately blind to how they're affecting them. Sorry about that. My dog wants to come in. I'll let her in a minute. But anyway, so the CBP giving clarity on what it will ask of companies to demonstrate that they're not causing, just contributing to, or benefiting from human rights abuses in the PRC. Are you giving training and telling people how they should be avoiding these contributing to human rights abuses in the PRC?
Thank you very much.
About what they should be doing.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. We are indeed speaking regularly through engagements as well as guidance that we have published to companies about what we expect from them.
Sorry, I'm going to start that. Please continue.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Continue.
We have published guidance, and we speak directly with C-suite executives and board directors and compliance teams at companies to tell them what we expect of them when it comes to supply chain transparency and due diligence. I think that is really one of the incredible features of the UFLPA, is that it turns the system around so that importers are responsible for knowing their own supply chain. They have to take the steps. They need to own the issue. We have published, through the Multi-Agency Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force that I'm honored to chair, substantial guidance for what are the best practices for achieving that supply chain transparency, conducting that supply chain due diligence, and managing risk when it comes to forced labor in very complex supply chains. And we have emphasized repeatedly that forced labor is now, in 2023, a top-tier compliance issue for companies that they have to own and take responsibility for. And I think that message has been clearly received. And I think it's been received based on the data I shared and the anecdotal evidence. And then I think if you look at our enforcement data, over $1.4 billion in shipments detained for inspection, then across a range of sectors, I think it speaks for itself, and the importing community has heard it and is responding. But there is more work to do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Undersecretary. I really appreciate that. Do you feel that you have the resources that you need in order to be able to do this work? I mean, do you feel like you have enough resources? I know that you said something about having to pull for resources from other places in order to be able to have the resources to get the committee up and running. And do you feel like you really have the resources that you need? You need more resources to be able to do this work.
Thank you for that question. We do need more resources to support both CBP's operations at the ports, as well as for the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force to maintain the entity list and do the other work that Congress charged it with doing. We very much appreciate the resources that Congress appropriated to CBP for forced labor enforcement recently, but more is needed both for CBP and the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. In the meantime, though, we are pulling resources from elsewhere in the department because, bottom line, this is a high priority area for us, and we are going to resource it to get the job done. But we would look forward to working with Congress to get us more so that we can do more quickly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Undersecretary. One other question for you. I very much appreciate you talking about the de minimis exception, because we've all seen companies popping up that are using this exclusively as their way of exporting, right? So the goods come directly from the factory, they don't go through customs. They go through the regular channels, and makes it really hard to be able to determine whether they've been made by by forced labor. So it makes it really hard to be able to enforce the UFLPA. And so I want to make sure that how we can best amend Section 321 to ensure companies like Shein, which stand credibly accused of exporting products sourced from forced labor, prohibited from exploiting the minimus loophole. How can we amend Section 321 to make sure that we don't have this problem anymore?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I share your concerns about potential abuse of the de minimis exception for packages valued at under $800. The UFLPA does apply. We do enforce in that context, but there are a lot of challenges to our enforcement given the volume of packages, limited data received as to those packages. We are procuring software that is helping us to better target in the de minimis environment. We are looking at regulatory and statutory changes that can help us procure better data and enforce more meaningfully in the de minimis context. But I do want to emphasize that de minimis is subject to UFLPA, and we take the issue quite seriously and are doing everything in our administrative ability to do it. Congresswoman, I do just also want to address, you mentioned that in the 10th Congressional District in Virginia, you have a very large Uyghur community. I just want to say that engaging with Uyghur communities across the United States has been one of the more fulfilling parts of my job. It is absolutely horrific what is happening to them and their family members in Xinjiang province, but it is also inspiring to see their resilience and their advocacy. And we appreciate the chance to honor them and be their champions through our enforcement of these laws.
You may mention, Mr. Undersecretary, I'm afraid I don't know how much time I have left. I have one more question, which is that, and without getting into sources and methods, could you please tell us a little bit about how you actually enforce the FLPA with the de minimis exception? Do you do spot checks with the carriers, or how do you determine what's actually being shipped?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We conduct data-driven targeting across the vast volume of trade that comes into this country every year, and we enforce based on our analysis of trade data, based on our use of technologies like supply chain mapping tools, based on referrals that we receive from non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, which so often are our ears and eyes on the ground, and we so value our partnership with them. Their activities have led to numerous enforcement actions by the Department of Homeland Security, and we act on other intelligence and data that we receive to make sure that any cargo that is coming into this country where we have a suspicion that forced labor might be involved is inspected thoroughly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Undersecretary. Mr. Chairman, I just have one more quick comment, which is we also need to make sure that we do work about the mutual pairing assistance program, because that's another way that they're getting around the whole Xinjiang issue. But anyway, we can deal with that another day. Thank you so much, Mr. Undersecretary, for being with us. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Let me just ask one final question. I have others that we'll submit for the record, but Inez Cantor-Freedom makes an excellent point about how China has absolutely silenced the NBA. He points out that one of his friends, Daryl Morey, who tweeted "Stand with Hong Kong," and then talked to Inez on his efforts with regards to free Tibet, and then he did free the Uyghurs. And he says, "Inez, don't give up. When I tweeted about Hong Kong, the NBA made me take down my tweet and made me apologize. They made me put statements out which I didn't want to put out." He then encouraged Inez to continue on because he felt so bad about what the NBA had done to him. Well, we have written our commission to the National Basketball Association's Players Association, and we asked them to inform and to help NBA players terminate contracts with Chinese sportswear companies like Anta, Li Ning, and Peak that all pledged to continue using cotton and rayon from Xinjiang. They are still selling those products on their websites as well as on Amazon. Again, you know the story of Inez Cantor-Freedom and what a heroic man he is. He has lost his entire career because he said free the Uyghurs. I can't believe, and I'll use the word again, the cowardice of the NBA in kowtowing to Xi Jinping and company, the Chinese Communist Party, to silence every single player. Well, now these individuals, we're trying to say, how do we help any NBA player get out from under being part of a sportswear using cotton and rayon, like I said, from Xinjiang? In your opinion, should goods from these companies be banned from import into the U.S. market?
Mr. Chairman, President Biden gave an interview on CNN a few days ago, and he was asked whether he would let up on criticizing the human rights situation in China as part of the administration's China policy. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, when it comes to slave labor, we're not staying quiet. That's just who we are. And at the Department of Homeland Security and on behalf of all the member agencies of the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, zero tolerance policy. Wherever the facts lead, we are going to enforce our forced labor laws strictly. And we have done so in year one, and we are only accelerating in our efforts. And I think that message has been received loud and clear from the importing community.
In your opinion, is Anta, Li Ning, and Peak violative of the Uyghur Forced Labor Act?
I'm not going to speak to particular companies and enforcement actions.
Would you take that back and really take a hard look at that?
But I will take it back, and I will also say, just at a more general level, that we can and have and will continue to enforce our forced labor laws when it comes to Xinjiang cotton. That is a prioritized enforcement area for us. We have taken enforcement actions with respect to Xinjiang cotton, regardless of who the apparel company is or what kind of label is on the product. And we're going to continue to do so because it's the law and it's the only right thing to do.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it, and really look forward to continue working with you and your department. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Co-Chair.
We're going to now move on to our next panel. I know Commissioner Wild, you had no questions, right? No questions. Okay, thank you. I'd like to now welcome to the witness table our second panel and thank them in advance for their tremendous leadership on these issues. First, we have Mr. Isaac Stone Fish, who is a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of the book America Second, How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. The book highlights how the PRC and Chinese Communist Party has leveraged, let me just have this one, please. Yeah. Pardon me. Okay. Yeah, I know. So to pick up where I left off, the book highlights how the PRC and Chinese Communist Party has leveraged its economic clout to demand political and ideological compliance across American corporations, Hollywood, and academic institutions. He has extensive insights on the Chinese Communist Party's pernicious influence in the U.S. and how it impacts our daily lives. In addition, Mr. Isaac Stone Fish is an adjunct at New York University Center for Global Affairs, a contributor to CBS News, a columnist on China, Risk at Barron's, and founder and CEO of the Strategy Risk Corporation. We will begin, though, however, with Mr. Enes Kanter Freedom. As a professional basketball player, he had a celebrated career in the National Basketball Association, having played for the Utah Jazz, New York Knicks, Oklahoma City Thunder, and Boston Celtics, just to name a few. 11 years. In 2021, leading up to the Beijing 2022 Genocide Games, Mr. Freedom became the most outspoken athlete, both on and off the basketball courts, about the PRC's human rights violations and the NBA's willingness to acquiesce to the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party. His commitment to speaking truth to power has led him to becoming ousted from the NBA. They fired him simply because he spoke truth to power. Just to give you some context of how a good player he was, what a good player, at the time of his banishment, his player efficiency rating among the NBA players all-time ranking was 61, a metric that basketball fans will absolutely recognize. Rather than buckling under and yielding, Mr. Freedom continued to stand tall and firm. In fact, social media app TikTok, which is owned by the Chinese company ByteDance, even banned his account because of his posts about Chinese human rights violations. His account was reinstated, however, after TikTok CEO was questioned about it before Congress. Well, Mr. Enes Kanter Freedom, I hope you will post about this hearing today to boost awareness of this important topic. We will then hear from Ms. Shi Ming Li, a Chinese Christian who also goes by the beautiful name of Hope, and she became a human rights advocate after her husband, Cheng Yuan, was arrested by the Chinese National Security Bureau in July of 2019. Chen Yuan was a prominent leader who championed health rights for the Chinese people. His work was so influential that the tyrannical regime in Beijing grew scared and accused him of subversion of state power. Chen Yuan is currently languishing in a Chinese prison located in China's Hunan province. This is a prison where political prisoners were found to be subject to forced labor, sewing glove for American tool manufacturing company Milwaukee Tools, gloves that are still sold on Amazon and at Home Depot locations across the United States. And I would note parenthetically that yesterday the commission wrote a letter to the leadership of Milwaukee Tool, the one I put into the record a few moments ago, to address this very issue. Ms. Shi Ming Li, motivated by her Christian faith and love of her husband, aims to expose and end forced labor of Chinese political prisoners. And thank you so much for being here and joining us today. Finally, we will be joined by Dr. Ann Kokas, who brings a wealth of knowledge on today's topic on corporate complicity. She's the author of Trafficking Data, How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty, which dives into how the Chinese government is essentially refining the art of gray zone warfare by influencing and exploiting the U.S. tech sector in Silicon Valley. Dr. Ann Kokas is also the author of the award-winning book, Hollywood Made in China, detailing how investments from China have shaped Hollywood. She is currently Associate Professor of Media Students at the University of Virginia, focusing on China-U.S. media and technology relations. And again, thank you for being here. What a panel of leaders, amazing leaders and experts. Thank you for your collective wisdom and individual. And this is the book. So thank you for giving me a copy.
Great.
I will read it in August when I read all my books. I'd like to now turn to Mr. Freedom for his testimony.
Yes. Chairman Smith and Co-Chairman Senator Merkley and the members of the Congressional-Executive Commission in China, thank you all for having us and having me here today. So I want to start with, I'm a basketball player. I love going out there, competing with my teammates and trying to win a championship. But some of the things that are happening in my life obviously made me took a very different route. So for the last 10 years, I have been talking about the problems that are happening in Turkey. There are lots of human rights violations and political prisoners over there. And, I remember my family had to publicly disown me because they were getting affected so much. They put my dad in jail, they raided my house, and just recently they put a bounty on my head. They put my name on Interpol list, and I have 12 arrest warning for me. When the topic was Turkey, the NBA was very supportive, especially the Commissioner Adam Silver and my teammates and the coaches and the 5 different organizations I play for. That actually gave me so much hope and motivation to fight against the dictatorship in Turkey. And just 3 years ago, I was actually doing a basketball camp in New York with the Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. And after the basketball camp, I was taking pictures with the kids one by one. And I remember taking a picture with this kid. And his parents called me out in front of everybody and said, how can you call yourself a human rights activist when your Muslim brothers and sisters are getting tortured and raped every day in concentration camp in China? So I turned around and I was like, I promise I'm going to get back to you. So that day I canceled everything. I went back to my hotel and I called my manager. I was like, I need you to find me a concentration camp survivor. He found a lady, we sit down and had a 1-hour conversation. And I remember she was telling me about all the torture methods and all the forced sterilization and abortion and stuff. And I was like, at the end of our conversation, I asked her, what can I do to help? She said, nothing. I was like, so we just had this 1-hour conversation for no reason? I was like, no. She said, I'm in America. I can do whatever I want. I can say whatever I want. And I can eat whatever I want. Help those 2 or 3 million Uyghurs who are in concentration camp. So I wanted to bring awareness, and I wanted to do it in a very unique way. Because I remember when I was a kid, whenever I watched an NBA game, the first thing I was watching was the shoes. What color they are, if they're comfortable. And the next day I was telling my dad, please buy those shoes for me. So we decided to reach out to these artists around the world and who's been oppressed by their government. And we created the shoes, non-slave labor, and we put all these messages on our shoes, which there was no rule against is because 3 years ago when we were in NBA bubble, all the players were putting on their shoes, Black Lives Matter, Black Revolution, George Floyd, which I'm not against. So my first topic was Free Tibet. Our first game, I was playing for Boston Celtics. Our first game was against New York Knicks, our biggest rivalry. And I remember putting on this Free Tibet shoes. I went out there, I started to warm up. A minute before the game, there was 2 gentlemen from Boston Celtics came to me and said, take your shoes off. I was like, excuse me? I was like, your shoes has been getting so much attention internationally, you gotta take your shoes off. It was the perfect moment for me because I was just getting ready for my citizenship test. So I closed my eyes, I was like, okay, there are 27 amendments. My first amendment, freedom of speech. I turned around and said, no, I'm not taking them off. So they're like, what are you talking about? I said, I don't care even if I get fined, I'm not taking them off. They said, we're not talking about a fine, we're talking about getting banned. So at the halftime, I went back to my locker room, I played 0 minutes, and I looked at my phone, there was thousands of notifications. I clicked on the one that my manager sent me. He said, every Celtics game is banned in China. it literally took them 24 minutes, first quarter, 12 minutes, second quarter, 12 minutes, to ban every Celtics game on television. So that game, I played 0 minutes, which I played every game before that. We lost the game, obviously. And after the game, there was a media storm, and I told my manager, I don't want to do no media because I don't want my teammates to think that I'm doing it for attention. So after the actually first game, the NBPA, the Player Association, called me and said, you know what you did, you can never wear those shoes ever again. I was like, am I breaking any rules? They said, no, but you cannot wear them ever again. I talk about the problems that are happening in Turkey for the last 10 years. All I got was support, but the topic was China one day, and my phone was ringing once every hour. So they were pressuring me and my manager so much, I was like, you know what? I promise I'm not going to wear free Tibet shoes ever again. They said, promise? I promise. I hang up the phone. So the next game, I wore free Uyghur shoes. So they called me after the game. They said, you're a liar. You lied to us. I was like, first of all, I never lied to you. I never said I'm not going to wear free Tibet shoes. I just said Uyghur shoes. I just said I'm just not going to wear free Tibet shoes. So after the third game, one of my teammates walked up to me and said, this is your last year in NBA, right? You're never going to get any contract after this because if you criticize NBA and Nike, it's over for you. And that pretty much happened. February came and, that got released and it was over for me. I want to say I love basketball. My job is I'm not a politician. I should be on a basketball court working out and getting ready for the season. But unfortunately, because of the things that I said, it's not going to happen. But you know what? It's bigger than myself. It's bigger than basketball. It's bigger than NBA. And I will continue to be, a voice of all those innocent people out there who don't have a voice. And thank you all for, organizing this beautiful hearing to be our voice. So this has definitely mean a lot to us. Thank you so much, guys.
Mr. Freedom, thank you so very much.
Of course, thank
for
you.
your courage, but also for what a sense of humor, despite all that you have.
You gotta laugh.
Thank you.
If you lose smile, you lose hope. So
Well, thank you.
thank you.
Sure, Hope herself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Merkley, and the Congressional-Executive Commission on China for commenting this hearing. My name is Shi Minglei. I'm the wife of a famous Chinese human rights activist Cheng Yuan, who is currently serving a 5-year sentence at a facility called Hunan Chisan Prison. There, as I will discuss in more detail later, prisoners are forced to work making gloves for a famous American brand, Milwaukee Tool. But first, I'd like to tell you about my husband. In 2008, Cheng Yuan left a job in finance to found an NGO called Nanjing-based Justice for All, which was initially focusing first on combating employment discrimination against the persons with hepatitis B, which is a significant issue in PRC. From there, he expanded his work to other areas of social justice, including advocated for an end to the PRC's one-child policy and standing up for the rights of laborers and Chinese human rights lawyers after the 709 crackdown by founding NGO Changsha Funeng. This work led PRC security agency to arrest him on July 22nd, 2019, and I haven't seen him since. He was arbitrarily detained, tortured, charged with subversion of state power, and secretly tried and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. That's how he ended up at Hunan Chisan Prison. Another activist who was imprisoned there is Li Mingzhe, a Taiwanese human rights activist who was arrested by the PRC government in March 2017 and released in April 2022. After his release, Li revealed that while he was imprisoned at Hunan Chisan Prison, he was forced to produce gloves, including gloves bearing the Milwaukee Tool logo. One of Li's jobs was to cut materials into shapes of a glove. Another of Li's job was sewing the cut materials into actual gloves. I'm told my husband is currently forced to do a significant amount of sewing as well. Li said that if prisoners refused to work or to meet the quota, they were subjected to a variety of punishment, including being forced to stand several hours straight, having their contact with family members cut off, and in some cases, being subjected to beating, including with actually electric batons. Li has attested to many of these facts under penalty of perjury and is willing to testify. to testify to them and us as well. Another recently released prisoner, whom I will refer to use pseudonym Shilun, as he is still in the PRC, has similarly reported being forced to produce gloves bearing the Milwaukee logo while imprisoned at Hunan Zhishan Prison. She confirmed that failure to meet the production quotas was met with punishment like being forced to stand and beaten and shot with electric batons. She also confirmed work days of about 11 hours a day, at least 6 days a week, with minimal breaks and only paid $3 per month. That works out to an hourly wage of 1 cent. Due to the lack of rule of law in the PRC, however, it is extremely dangerous for former prisoners located there to speak publicly to these issues. This is precisely why big companies like Milwaukee are able to get away with benefiting from forced labor in the PRC. They know that the lack of human rights protections in PRC means it's difficult, if not impossible, for Britain to hold them accountable. Meanwhile, it's extremely beneficial to Milwaukee's bottom line if those who are actually making their gloves are paid only 1 cent per hour. Of course, they would prefer to have their gloves manufactured in the PRC rather in the States, where they would have to pay workers several thousand times more, and where the kinds of abuses people like Ms. Li and Ms. Xu suffered would not be tolerated. In this way, American workers can also be counted among the victims of Milwaukee's disregards of human rights. As for my husband, I'm deeply concerned about his well-being. In recent visits by other family members, he has confirmed that he is forced to work 11 to 12 hours a day, hunched over a sewing machine. He was also put into solitary confinement for 3 months, tortured, forced to stand for hours, and being deprived of sleep and food, and forced to drink water from the toilet. Just Mr. Chairman, senators, and CECC representatives, I'm calling on you to stop American companies like Milwaukee from using forced labor in the PRC now. I'm looking forward to taking questions, but maybe not able to answer all these questions due to safety concerns and contemplated litigation. Thank you.
Ms. Scher, thank you very much for your testimony and for your courage as well, and for your great love for your husband.
Thank you.
We'll all continue to pray for him. Thank you. And work for his release. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Fish.
Commissioners, I appreciate your focus on these issues and issues that we ignore at our peril. I'd like to talk about business complicity both in the present and issues I'm worried about in the future. And the major one is lack of transparency. Congressman Smith, you talked about Anta earlier. I don't know if folks realize that Anta also owns Louisville Slugger, the beloved American brand, and Wilson. And Anta itself has very clear ties to forced labor. I do wonder if Major League Baseball, tennis associations understand how they're being complicit with forced labor by using those brands, storied American brands. On the issue of transparency, American corporations for decades have been very entwined with China and the Chinese Communist Party. And as corporations have become more vocal in the United States, they've become more quiet about what they're doing in China. And we have wonderful laws and tools that push that. The UFLPA, I think, is a fantastic one. I worry right now about how easy it is for American corporations to support the Chinese military. There's a focus on civil-military fusion, but frankly, it's a lot simpler than that. The People's Liberation Army, the military in China, is the armed wing of the Communist Party. It's not a separate organization. So any SOE is part of the same organization as the PLA. Bank of China, ICBC, a lot of these major companies are just part of the same organization that is the Chinese military and may at some point soon be killing Americans. The other issue I want to talk about is the way that major American military companies have deep ties to China. Boeing, Raytheon. I'm quite worried about the fact that the most important defense primes have major markets in China, Boeing especially. And in China, there are no private airlines. Every plane that Boeing sells in China it sells to the Communist Party. And so we're in a situation where we're facilitating not only the growth of the Chinese economy and the Chinese military, but also making it so American corporations have different interests and incentives than a lot of the people in this building. I want to continue with that and talk very concretely about the risks of war. We are at a very perilous time right now. And I worry that we're not having the national conversation about what would happen if China invades Taiwan. What does that mean for major American corporations who not only may be acting against the interests of the American people, but also, frankly, are putting a lot of their Chinese staff in danger? This commission so wonderfully focuses on vulnerable people in China. And I don't think we really think through, oh, if China invades Taiwan, so many people who have worked for Apple and Microsoft and Boeing will be seen by the Chinese Communist Party potentially as enemy combatants. And they will be harassed and they will be rounded up and potentially worse things will happen. And it's unfortunate that I have to speak this way, but we are in a scenario where, again, I can't predict the future, but we are in a scenario where World War III might be upon us, and there'll be massive, massive ethical concerns for that. I'm also quite worried about treatments of Chinese Americans here. We have a horrible history in this country of rounding up people who are citizens or were citizens of countries that we were fighting, Germans in World War I, Japanese in World War II. And we need to have a national conversation about how we're going to ethically protect our own, we're going to protect Chinese Americans. It's something that really, really worries me, and it's something that I think we need to talk about. The solutions are already in our wonderful political toolbook. It's open and raucous debate. It's more transparency for American companies. Most American companies don't break out their China revenue, so we have a very difficult time of knowing what exactly they're doing in China. The more we can learn, the more we can understand, the better that it is. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fish, so much for that testimony and your leadership. Ms. Kokas.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chairman Smith, Thank you, Chairman Smith, Co-Chairman Merkley, and distinguished members of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China. It is an honor to present my testimony. As the U.S. grapples with how to approach China's expanding digital influence, fragmented U.S. laws interact with expansive Chinese government oversight in a way that pressures corporations to prioritize compliance with Chinese laws and policies. Drawing from my recent books, Trafficking Data and Hollywood Made in China, I recommend enhanced data oversight in the U.S. to reduce digital rights violations by tech corporations from both the U.S. and China. More comprehensive U.S. digital oversight would align the U.S. with its allies and partners and countervail against pressures companies face from Chinese regulations. I look forward to the discussion and would be happy to expand on any of these points during questioning, but let me highlight the key points of my testimony. First, U.S. technology oversight assumes corporations have the capacity to track and mitigate harm, which we've seen time and again is not actually the case in many situations. Second, most Chinese corporate data oversight laws have extraterritorial scope and non-transparent enforcement. The opacity of these laws obscures which firms are exploiting data and generating other harms in the normal course of their operations, not just in China, but in the US and with our allies and partners. Number three, limited US data protections and the potential for financial, civil, and criminal penalties in China incentivizes following Chinese laws where there are not US equivalents. So by not regulating within the US, it's not that we're creating more freedom for our companies, it's that we're incentivizing them to follow Chinese laws. Number four, similar pressures encourage firms to modify content to adhere to Chinese laws. In the absence of comprehensive data privacy oversight, the patchwork of sector-based and state-based oversight in the US fails to keep pace with evolving technologies. I'm thinking about things like the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which does not cover key technologies like commercial DNA testing and smart health monitoring, or COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which does not account for the ways that children's data is accessible on devices like Amazon's Alexa, Google Home, and how increasingly savvy users under the age of 13 are able to access that user data anyway. And finally, on the mental health impacts on teens who are over the age of 13, many of whom we see at the University of Virginia. States offer different protections for their citizens, different access for corporations to user data, biometric data, financial data, and access to different state networks and devices. This creates a very difficult environment for any sort of compliance. And as a result, states have an incentive, or companies have an incentive to choose to go to different states rather than to comply with data oversight. But corporate and user data oversight form the foundation of a wide range of emerging and information and communication technologies like generative AI. So therefore, long-term competitiveness depends on good US data protection laws. Now, by contrast, in China, what we see is uneven enforcement and forced data localization. In China's 2017 cybersecurity law, requires critical information infrastructure data to be stored in China. The Personal Information Protection Law expands data localization requirements to make the transfer of data overseas subject to a security assessment by the Cyberspace Administration of China, very broadly defined. Similarly, opaque enforcement encourages corporations to comply with the most conservative interpretations of the law. For example, China's National Security Data Audit System, established by the Data Security Audit, which has extraterritorial implications, so applies to companies that operate in China and in the US, can review any data or might influence that might influence national security. Similarly opaque are the oversight mechanisms of the 2020 Hong Kong National Security Law, which I know that this commission has dealt with in great depth. So corporations in the United States that are subject to Chinese laws face significant pressure to comply with Chinese laws in the absence of US data protections in areas like the connected device industries, precision agriculture, gaming, payment, mobility, communication sectors, and beyond. I talk about these in my book, Trafficking Data, and I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A as well. So we also see that pressures for Chinese market access interact with US laws to shape content. Now, this is an area that I talk about in my book, Hollywood Made in China. We've had the recent, and in 2019, Abominable contained a map of contested Chinese maritime claims. I know some of you may have heard about the discussions of the Barbie movie over this past weekend. If you want to talk about that, I'm happy to discuss it further. We also saw the recent case with Top Gun Maverick. Now, my recommendations are as follows, and I focus primarily on the digital sector because I think this is an area where Congress needs to act and where this commission's leadership is essential. First of all, working with allies and partners to establish standards for international data transfer, aligning adequacy standards for cross-border data transferred with the European Union and Japan and other allies and partners. Join or rejoin key trade agreements that enhance transparency in cross-border data transfers. Enhance U.S. oversight to prevent international data trafficking through things like the Bipartisan Restrict Act, which we just heard Senator Warner discussing was subject to, I think he mentioned $100 million of TikTok lobbying money. Regulate the data broker industry. We also see the Uphold Privacy Act of 2023 and the Protecting Military Service Members Data Act of 2023 offering first steps in this direction. Enhancing SEC reporting of data storage practices by publicly traded firms, and then building out a national security data privacy to mitigate data trafficking. Finally, and this is what I say as the director of the East Asia Center at the University of Virginia, fund Chinese area studies. A lot of companies don't necessarily know what they're doing because they don't have people who work in those companies with this expertise. This is of crucial national security importance, and I look forward to the Commission's leadership on this. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Kokos. Senator Merkley has a vote pending on the Senate, so I certainly yield to our distinguished co-chair.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to turn right away to the NBA. And I believe before the experience that you went through, Mr. Freedom, Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, had tweeted in support of Hong Kong. And I think he suffered immediate backlash as well. So I just want to make the point that this is not just one vignette. This is a absolutely broader challenge because of the amount of money the NBA seeks to make in China. Did you have conversations with any of the NBA players who were considering or had endorsement deals with the Chinese sportswear companies? And did you get any kind of feedback from them, or did you get any support from players for the stand you were taking?
You know, when I started to talk about the problems that are happening in China, it was the perfect moment, Beijing Winter Olympics. People called it genocide games. So forget about the NBA. I try to reach out to NFL, MLB, MLS, NHL, WWE. I even try to reach out to Olympians. I was like, listen, you know, while we are dribbling a ball, on the other side of the world, there's a genocide happening. You know, we can come together and we can actually bring so much voice for these innocent people. You know, they all said the same thing. They said, listen, I think what you're doing is so courageous, so inspirational. Keep doing what you're doing. We love you, we support you, but we just cannot do it out loud. I asked them a simple question. You know, I asked them why. They said, well, you know, we have deals. We want to get another contract with the league that we play with. And then my following question was to them, put yourself in their shoes. If your mother, if your sister, if your daughter was in those concentration camps, getting tortured and raped every day, would you still pick money and business over your morals, values, and principles? They usually turn around and leave the room, you know? And the one thing that broke my heart, I played 11 years in NBA. I had hundreds of teammates, hundreds of coaches. I had so much, you know, friends who I used to call them my brothers because I used to see them more than my family, which I haven't seen them over 10 years. After I got released, not one of them texted me and said, good luck with whatever is coming to your way next. Not one of them called me. I was shocked. I started to ask myself, am I doing anything wrong? You know, I don't talk about politics because human rights is above politics. I don't care if you're from the right, from the left, whoever party you cheer for, whoever you voted for, you have to care about human rights. So they were just scared about if I do an interview or if I ever talk about, if I do a podcast, they just didn't want me to mention their name because they knew that if I ever say, oh, this player supported me, this player said this and that, and all their endorsement deals will be gone. So it was a very lonely road for the last year and a half, but I still check their stats. I still see if they're healthy or not. I still cheer for the Celtics, cheer for the teams that I play for. I just hope that they should understand. They understand at the end that, you know, what we're doing is, what I'm trying to do is bigger than basketball, bigger than NBA, bigger than everything that we ever done. So.
Well, we all greatly appreciate your stand on behalf of human rights. And I personally, and Congresswoman Salinas coming from Oregon, we also appreciated greatly your time with the Portland Trailblazers.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so much. I had an amazing time there.
Ms. Shi, has Milwaukee Tool acknowledged the problem or their involvement with prison forced labor in China?
No, we sent several letters, and we also required a conversation, but they refused to meet me in person.
Are there other American companies in a very parallel position to Milwaukee Tool that you've had any contact with?
Yes, I also found another American company involved in this case. We can hand over the details later.
And
by the way, we also contact Walmart, Home Depot, and Amazon because they are the major channels on Milwaukee Toll. Fortunately, Walmart took action after I sent a letter to their CEO, and they deleted Milwaukee Toll gloves on their website. And they also promise they won't sell it anymore in the store. But Home Depot and Amazon, till now, they're still selling the Milwaukee Toll gloves made by First Labor.
One of the things that we've discussed a lot on this commission is transnational repression, in which those who stand up for human rights here in America, their families are threatened. Obviously, your husband's already suffering in prison. Has anyone walked up to you on the street and said, we know where the other family members are in China, and are intimated that there would be further consequences of your speaking out?
Until now, I think I'm safe in the States. But actually, when I was in China, since my husband arrested, I was suddenly put into home arrest for half a year. And also they accused me as subversion of state power, even my job is only like global e-commerce in the business area.
Thank you. And Mr. Fish, are there examples of U.S. companies that have been challenged by China who have stood up to China that we can celebrate in a more positive way?
So it's a great question. And unfortunately, the companies that do that don't want to get credit for it. We work with a lot of these companies, and reporters will come to me and say, hey, I'd love to do a positive piece on a company that's reducing its exposure to China. And so I'll talk to our clients and they'll say, absolutely not. And I do hope that that changes, because I do think it's a very important trend. And I do think people need to know, especially people in the business community, that there is a way to reduce your exposure to China, to reduce your reliance on the Communist Party, and still make money and succeed. But unfortunately, all of the companies that I know that would fit that qualifications would much prefer to be silent. And I think that's a shame.
Thank you. My time is up, but I'll submit some questions to the record about whether we should have disclosure requirements for U.S. companies doing business in China, and if so, what those should look like, and other issues related to companies facing penalties for violating PRC laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you so much again, each of you, for your testimonies, your leadership, and I'm looking forward to reading your book during the August recess, so-called district work period, as we really refer to it as. I do have a number of questions. Let me just say for the record, we will invite the NBA and the NBA Players Association to testify. Obviously, they're free to turn us down. I hope they won't. I hope that they realize that the courage that Enes Kanter Freedom has provided is something that they all ought to ascribe to. Injustice need not be forever, and I would argue cowardice need not be forever. Money should not trump standing up for people who are being, as you pointed out, Mr. Freedom, who are being raped every day, who are being so horribly mistreated. Children, it is genocide. And genocide, remember what Limkin said, who remembers the Armenians many, many years back, which when he coined the phrase genocide. Same goes for the Holocaust. We really do need to be much more vigilant and strong, and you have done that at great cost to yourself. And I'm in awe of that kind of courage. And the fact that the others have not, and I'm sure in their heart of hearts, many of your fellow players do have strong concerns about what is going on in all of China, but also in Xinjiang with the genocide. And so thank you for that leadership. We will invite them. We'll invite Milwaukee Tool to come and others. And I would point out that we had a number of hearings. I chaired one in the Atlantos Commission, our distinguished chair at the time, now co-chair, Senator Merkley, before the Olympics. And we had companies come and testify. And I remember Coca-Cola, I asked them specifically about the genocide, and it was like he lost his voice. Wouldn't say a word because of fear of losing market access. And again, the more that we enabled the Chinese Communist Party through our acquiescence to those bullying tactics, the more that they will use them. I remember even when Liu Xiaobo got the Nobel Peace Prize, there were threats made against the Peace Prize Committee and others. And it was like that was the last we heard of it. And I was there. I'm the one who led the effort in Congress to have him and two others named as Peace Prize recipients. And it was like forgotten so quick because China was threatening whole countries about their support of Liu Xiaobo. They wouldn't even let his wife go, and accept the Nobel Peace Prize. So, but again, Senator, I do thank you. You had those corporations here at that hearing, and it was very telling how fearful they were of saying just one word about the genocide and about all things human rights-wise with China. We had argued, just for the record, very vigorously. Senator Marco Rubio and I had written letters to the Olympic Committee because they got these bogus assurances from the Chinese Communist Party that they would adhere to human rights. It was like, are you kidding me? It's deeds, not words. Their words are very deceptive, if not outright lies. So, and in this case, it was. In the issue of having the Olympics, it's too bad that the Genocide Olympics did occur there. I'm all for the Olympics, but not there, and as we all are. So I do thank you again for all of that. We will invite the NBA. I hope they say yes sooner rather than later, because I think if a few others follow your courageous lead, it could have a very cascading positive effect on human rights, because now they know so they barred the Celtics TV coverage in China for a while. Big deal. I mean, is money everything? I hope not. And, it was discouraging to watch Bill Gates as he met with Xi Jinping the other day. He's done some work on health and the like. But Microsoft and others have been enablers in the most egregious ways for decades. I had a hearing back in 2006 in which I invited Microsoft, Yahoo, Cisco, and Google to talk about how they were censoring and providing personally identifiable information on users to the Chinese secret police. So I swore them all in. I asked, why are you following that? Yahoo had given up all this information that put Shurtao into prison for 10 years about the Tiananmen Square remembrances. 10 years for just conveying to a human rights group in New York how they were being censored about what they could say about Tiananmen Square. We had, during that hearing, the Google that you would get in China, that showed that Tiananmen Square, and not a single mention of the massacre, of the bayoneting, all part of the big lie. The bigger the lie, the better, I think, from the Chinese Communist Party. And they were all part of it. I pointed out that IBM, and I read a book called IBM and the Holocaust, and IBM then called my office and was complaining, very well footnoted, about how they helped the Gestapo go after individuals because they had very, very good capabilities. They shared it all with the Nazi Party and the Gestapo, and they found Jewish people and others who were unmentionables and obviously put them into concentration camps. So it was really what a telling, and here we have it being repeated now as it was in 2006 at this hearing. So we need to learn from it, and big corporations and tech really need to do far more to be on the side of freedom and democracy and not on the side of human rights abuse. Let me just also Ms. Sher, to you, are you in any kind of contact with your husband? What is his welfare and?
Yeah, so since January this year, my family members can visit him, but before that, 3.5 years, we couldn't visit him. But still, my letters to him through my sister-in-law were all seized by the prison, and even some photos of me and my 7-year-old daughter, and they just deprived the photos, and so it's really hard for me to contact with him. Yeah.
The Mr. Fish, one of the issues of the transference of military capability and know-how, dual-use items, which they have picked up almost with impunity to turn into a force that we may face someday, that Taiwan may face sooner rather than later, sadly. You might recall the Cox Commission. Christopher Cox, a member of Congress from California, did an amazing job, a bipartisan commission that looked at all of that and said, we're arming China. We're making them a first-rate, capable, militarily speaking, courtesy of making money off of them. Use aircraft and all these others were more than accommodating to give them everything they possibly want. You mentioned about an issue that we have not, or I haven't, focused on enough, and that is especially the Chinese nationals who are working for U.S. corporations. Should the balloon go up and there is fighting, God forbid, but there could be, how at risk they will be. And when you mentioned Boeing, I immediately thought of McDonnell Douglas and Boeing and all of the airlift capability that gives their troops. In the United States, our entire, whether it be American Airlines or United, should we go to war, they get pressed into service to move troops and materiel. Well, what do you think the Chinese will do with our aircraft that we sold them. And, this myopic view that so many have here that just sell and, make a buck and move on. Well, that could be used to move troops as well. So you might want to speak to that issue because Cox Commission was in the 1990s. Why haven't we learned? And again, on the data, if I could I look forward to reading your book. Your testimony was excellent. Your leadership is excellent. Maybe you could just elaborate a little more on what we could be doing to mitigate the damage because it's, is it too far gone? I was sickened by the Gates interview with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping ought to be at The Hague for crimes against humanity, not having Americans, business leaders in that case, and American politicians. I look at this in a bipartisan way. When Brent Scowcroft traveled to Beijing right after the Tiananmen Square massacre to assure the Chinese Communist Party, no problem here, I was shocked. He's a Republican, and I spoke out then. I feel similarly about the kowtowing that's going on by some in our government. Thankfully, our first witness is not in that group, Mr. Silvers, and is standing up strongly, but not enough people are. So maybe I could start with Mr. K. Freedom, if you just wanted to further comment.
Yes, of course. Thank you. I think even just, bringing awareness is very important. But more than awareness, when we're in the locker room, we always say, let's play hard, let's play smart, let's have fun. And the coach comes in and says, well, don't just talk about it, be about it. So it is important for here to just talk about and bring awareness. But I think we need to figure out what can we do to help those people over there. And like you said, Chairman, this is a non-political issue. This is a human rights issue. So every part of the country needs to just help those people over there, because while we are living comfortably in this country, on the other side of the world, people are losing their lives, losing their homes, and losing their loved ones. So we gotta do whatever we can to help those people over there. So like I said again, I'm not a politician. I'm an athlete. I still consider myself an athlete. So you guys know better than me for what we can do or not. But like I said again, those people over there can't even breathe anymore. So we got to do whatever we can to help those people over there.
I do hope you will inspire other NBA players, including the NBA Players Association, to stand with you. And you ought to be invited back based on your skill and your ability, and not the fact that you.
Of course. Many athletes over there, sign contracts, not only NBA, but companies like Nike. Nike, I mean, just look at Nike. Nike, stands with Black Lives Matter in this country. They stand with LGBTQ community. They stand with no Asian hate, Latino community. But everybody knows about the slave laborers and sweatshops. They keep preaching about how important the social justice issues are, but when it comes to using slave labor, they are one of the biggest company that uses slave labor. So we gotta do whatever we can to put pressure on these companies. So,
Thank you. Of course. We will invite Nike as well.
I love it.
You sure?
Yeah, last Saturday, we went to Home Depot, bring our kids. So I have one daughter, she's 7-year-old. Every time she go to Home Depot with me, she will look around and see whether the Milwaukee gloves are still there. She even know exactly the 3 models made in the Hunan Chizan prison. And last Saturday, Daniel, another kid, whose father is Chinese human rights lawyer Chang Weiping, also detained in China, and they just moved to Minnesota, and we hosted them. And he also, he went Home Depot along with us, and he said, Auntie Shi, if you failed the lawsuit against the Milwaukee Toll, when I grow up, I will be a lawyer and I will do the lawsuit for you. He's only 10-year-old. How we proceed this information to the kids, but my daughter also know, don't buy Nike because they are using slave labor. Because their daddy are good human rights activists in China. So I really encourage them to continue to think positively and continue, no, God love us and God have justice. But every time it's just a feel heartbroken, talking with the hard issues with our kids. So we need to take some action now, and we hope all the products made by forced labor in China need be banned immediately, and also we hope the companies should be accountable for that. Thank you.
Mr. Fisher.
Thank you. That was an excellent point about the military. Companies complain about regulations, but sometimes they love them because they can hide behind them. And so having a regulation or a law that restricts the ability of American companies to support the PLA, to enter into joint ventures with the PLA, or to source from PLA-owned factories will be a massive compliance headache, but it will also allow major US companies to say, listen, I still want to do business in China, I just have to follow US laws, so I have to reduce my investment in the PLA, I have to move out from all of these issues. And it's a compromise and it's a way to work, and I think the UFLPA is a very excellent model for that. I'll make another point about Scope 3 emissions, which are basically emissions that a company makes throughout its life cycle. You brought up the great example of cobalt mining in the DRC. For so many companies, Scope 3 is just China. They have such massive manufacturing presences there. So regardless of which side of the aisle you are on climate change, forcing more environmental transparency forces companies to disclose how exposed they are to China and the Chinese market. And it's another way of both increasing transparency and raising the cost of investment in China.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Ms. Kokas.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith, and thank you for that excellent question. So to your final question of, are we too far gone? I teach a class called The Data Ethics of TikTok at the University of Virginia, and I have our students read the TikTok Terms of Service, and they read it, they get very depressed, but then they still stay on TikTok. And this is their question is, what can we do? And one of the answers is we need systemic regulation so that these are not decisions that 18-year-olds have to make by themselves while reading terms of service ad nauseum. And also one of the things we talk about is the importance of mitigation strategies. So no, we're not going to solve the issue of data trafficking and international data transfers. It's just like probably in the forced labor context, we were just talking about the de minimis issue and how it's very difficult to resolve it. But does that mean we don't try to mitigate? No, we keep working. And so some low-hanging fruit includes joining or rejoining trade agreements like the CPTPP, which China is trying to join and Taiwan is trying to join and has data transfer agreements, enhancing reporting requirements for companies through existing mechanisms like the Securities Exchange Commission. Where are they storing their data? How are they transferring it? National security data privacy, we've had some movement in this direction. So the American Data Privacy and Protection Act was introduced last year, and there were admittedly problems with it, but it's a step forward. And right now, the US is so behind our allies and partners in a lot of these issues in terms of data privacy and protection that we can't even come to consensus with the people that we normally agree with things on. So I think that this is a really important area that Congress can move on, and not just for me, not just for the people on this panel, but for all of the people who are coming forward and are feeling rather hopeless right now. Thank you.
Commissioner Salinas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Kokas, and thank you all to all the panelists. Your testimony paints a really revealing picture of the risks posed to Americans, both by the lack of strong standardized data protections in the US and by our exposure to Chinese laws. And clearly Congress has its work cut out for us to ensure that we're able to protect Americans' data. In fact, we just saw a data breach in Oregon of almost our entire DMV system, so about 3 million Oregonians, nearly the entire population of the state. So can you talk a little bit more about the implications of strong domestic privacy laws for international norms?
Yeah, so I spent last summer in Japan as an Abe Fellow, and one of the really interesting parts about that dynamic was talking with Japanese policymakers about their data transfer agreements and the data adequacy agreement that they had established with the European Union, and how by not having those data adequacy agreements with the United States, it actually prevented them from being able to have better trade with the US, more alignment in terms of ballasting against Chinese data gathering in Japan, in the European Union, in the United States. So by making the decision to kind of go our own way, and there's a reason for this. It didn't occur by accident. It's that we have enriched, the country has enriched itself, and I have probably personally enriched myself through my 401k balance by the rapid growth of tech stocks. And this is a way that we're able to grow and enrich the country, but it's also now tech companies do not have the same types of incentives that they once did in terms of the alignment with US national security interests. Also, these have become really significant international issues that are driving a lot of national security interests, not just domestically, but internationally. And the power of the Chinese tech sector means that this isn't something that the US can do by itself. So I thank you for your question. And also, just to one of my points, the importance of aligning state and national standards and using federal resources to help provide technical support for state organizations, which are really doing their best, but are often faced with quite untenable circumstances.
Thank you. Mr. Fish, you noted that the key to addressing corporate complicity in Chinese human rights violations is to promote transparency. And as a reporter, you have no doubt, I'm sure, thought about the consequences of bringing to light previous opaque connections. I wonder, though, whether transparency is sufficient. We heard about the MBA's connections to China. Mr. Cantor Freedom has clearly brought about a high degree of public awareness of how the NBA works to appease the Chinese government to protect its own businesses. We've heard of TikTok making headlines for risking the exposure of Americans' data. These kinds of stories are widely reported. My question is transparency enough to reform corporate operation? And what kinds of disclosures would you like to see that might actually have some teeth? And what, as members of Congress, do we need to do to put those teeth in there?
Thank you. I think those are excellent questions. In the spirit of transparency, I'm an ex-reporter. I run a data and consulting company, so I don't want to pretend to be speaking objectively on these really important issues. I think you're absolutely right. I think transparency is a step, but there's far more that needs to happen. I think the national security argument is a very important one, and letting companies know and understand that unless they take action, the US government's going to get very involved in a way that's bad for corporations and bad for the US government. And that if tensions worsen and China gets close to, or God forbid, invades Taiwan, national security concerns will take over, and there's massive amounts of human rights implications with that. And I hope we're careful and can take a deep breath and have conscious debate at that time, but companies need to know that they're going to be in a very difficult situation. And I think the argument that we find to be the most effective, and it's sad that this is true, it's not about national security, it's not about human rights, it's about regulatory risk, and it's about bottom line. And so making it clear to companies that this is how this loses you money, and that reducing your exposure to China has very clear financial benefits. So one of the issues is with hacking and with IP. Companies pay massive externality costs because of all the technology that they just leak into the Chinese ecosystem. And that's a very major cost. And the more that we bring that to light, the more companies can calculate that better on their bottom line. Another one is insurance. Insurance premiums on deals in China are way too low because we're not properly pricing the risk. And the government has a role that it can play in that. And so if you make it more expensive through insurance for companies to make certain kinds of investments in China, it's going to change the math for them, and they're going to do it differently. The other thing that I think is very effective, and I applaud this commission for doing it, is companies are very afraid of being hauled in front of Congress to testify. It's embarrassing, it distracts their CEO time, it allows and forces them to answer difficult questions. So the more that companies understand that, the better it is. And the final thing I'll say is the role that consumers can play. Consumers are far more critical of Beijing, the Communist Party, than Wall Street and then the executive branch of the government, I would argue. And so the more that actual consumers have a voice in their purchasing decisions, the more that they know about where the goods, the labor that they're producing comes from, the more likely that they'll push against what corporations are doing, and corporations will speak to the market and act to reduce their China exposure.
Thank you. Thank you again to the panelists, and I yield back.
Commissioner Nunn.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and also to the bipartisan panel here. I think this is not only a really good conversation, it's incredibly timely. Professor Kugas, you highlighted at the beginning that when the United States government fails to define this battle space, the Chinese will do it for us. And I think that is an absolute truism. You need only look at what Ms. Xi has highlighted today as being so very true. I would offer the same is also true for our business and innovation sector. If we in the United States fail to define this battle space, the Chinese are going to do it for us. Mr. Cantor Freedom, more than a decade playing professional sports in the NBA. I mean, you are an individual who came from a community that had a totalitarian regime to the United States. You're now an amazing US citizen. You're still an incredible basketball player. You came under this vacuum of leadership by corporate America to allow the Chinese to define what would be our principles in the United States simply because you wore a pair of shoes that said, I don't support the Chinese government's abuse of Tibet or its abuse of the Uyghurs. Who specifically did you feel the most pressure from? Was it someone in China or was it somebody happening right here in the United States?
So it was actually the Player Association, which I give thousands of dollars every month to protect my rights against the NBA, you know? And I was very confused. I'm like, why are they pressuring me? They should be on my side, not the NBA side.
Absolutely right.
And one of my teammates said, well, if there's no NBA, there's no Player Association. So they got to do whatever they can to put a pressure on you. Even one point, I was talking to someone from the NBPA, the Player Association. They said, if you don't if you don't stop wearing those shoes, we are going to change the rules. So no one can put any kind of message on their shoes. And I was like, I cannot believe that they are telling me that they're going to change the whole rule in NBA so no one can, because it was so beautiful seeing all those players are writing these beautiful messages on their shoes about their kids, about if someone passed away, RIP to blah, blah, you know. It was a beautiful message. And then during the NBA bubble, NBA was telling us, you know, be outspoken about the social justice are happening in America. They put the BLM logos on the floor. They put the phrases behind our jersey, which was controlled by the NBA. We couldn't pick what we wanted to pick and stuff. So Adam Silver was the one telling all the players, hey, just go out there and speak, give interviews and stuff. And all of a sudden, when the topic was China, you know, they were just all silent and they were just going against what I was saying, which was non-political, you know. So it was someone from America, and I was like, how can the biggest dictatorship in the world, China, can control a 100% American-made company and fire a U.S. citizen? And I would just keep asking that question to myself. I was like, are we really free? Is it only NBA? The more I study, the more I realize NBA is not the only one. You see Hollywood, Wall Street, academias, big tech, you know, farmland. And I started to ask this question to myself. We just keep talking about the freedom we have in this country. Are we really free? So no, it was literally someone from the NBA who was American. So,
Mr. Cantor Freedom, you highlight the story of wearing free Tibet shoes. As an amazing NBA player, you were didn't play a single game when you wore those shoes. And within 24 minutes of that game alone, the Chinese government said that they were going to pull all Boston Celtics games. And as a result, the NBA basically not only pressured you, but gave, one, the Boston Celtics a horrible loss. Two, deprived the people of China a great opportunity to see not only a great game, but really give an on-ramp for more Chinese to see what is true and great about America, our freedom of speech. But three, perhaps worst of all, we saw an American institution who wraps itself in the flag and is proud to stand on every social issue for the voice of, as you highlighted, our First Amendment freedom of speech rights, but then muzzles our own American population because of a hopeful pot of money coming out of China to keep them going. This is frustrating not only on multiple levels, and Mr. Fish has highlighted this. This is the soft power that China controls all over the world. But to have it come home to roost here in the United States puts us in a highly detrimental place, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate that this commission is really looking at what the Chinese have done to subvert our own basic freedoms in the US, as they've done in Ms. Xi's case back home. I want to speak very specifically now on a couple of issues that are of acute interest. Professor, you know, I'm an information operations warfare officer with the U.S. Air Force. One of the things that we have looked at specifically is this relationship that China has tried to manipulate the battle space, specifically in the digital sector. Can you please speak about some of these emerging technologies, specifically artificial intelligence, blockchain with China's blockchain-based service network, their consumer-facing applications, as you highlighted, TikTok here domestically, but WeChat domestically in China, and the contribution of the Chinese Communist Party's global surveillance state for data collection and how it's manipulating? It's a lot.
But I love it. It's a great question. I won't be able to answer it all today right here, but I'll do my best. So I like to think about this in 3 different levels. So on one hand, the risk that kind of comes up most commonly is the risk to individuals. So like what's happening when I'm being surveilled? I would argue that this is actually kind of the smaller level. We can kind of even put that aside because most people are not that interesting. Maybe members of this committee, but most people are not. Then there's this level of economic competitiveness. So it's the fact that there's this asymmetrical trade in data between the US and China. So companies like ByteDance and the companies like TikTok can operate in the US, but equivalent firms cannot operate in China. So there's data that companies in the US are able to gather and then as a result, Chinese firms are able to outcompete US firms in the US. So this is an economic competitiveness risk, which then feeds into also this, when we talk about the communication space, the movement out of kind of a creation of controlled communication environments where we don't actually know precisely what the terms of service mean, what the long-term implications are, and there aren't really mechanisms in the US to prevent private companies from executing on their own terms of service. Right. So in the event that this changes our communication environment, there's very little that we can do. Now, in the context of something like WeChat, people who start WeChat accounts in China and then continue using them in the US, there was a Citizen Lab report that noted that Chinese registered accounts, and even those that switch to international numbers, can still be subject to Chinese terms of service. So we are already seeing this kind of expansive censorship and expansive use of Chinese government extraterritorial oversight in a US context. Now, when we think about the long-term issues of things like generative AI, this asymmetrical trade becomes particularly important because these firms, as a result of civil-military fusion, are pressured by the Chinese government and can be pressured by the PLA to share their insights to be able to develop new tools in a wide range of different areas, from health to communication to financial services. And these not only outcompete, but they also have dual uses. So one area that I thought was very interesting that I couldn't do a lot of research on because of my lack of clearance was the precision medicine industry and the investment of Chinese firms in the precision medicine industry in the US, and the development not just of new precision medicine tools, but of potentially bioweapons in the long term. So that's something that I would, in your context, perhaps look at in greater depth.
Both enlightening and frightening at the same time.
Thank you.
The other area that you highlighted here is the unseen, or the uneven, I will say, enforcement by the CCP. Here in the United States, at least you have the ability to go in front of a court and have your day. For a recent series of raids done by the Chinese Communist Party on U.S. financial sectors, I'm talking here Bain, Mintz Capital, these growing hostilities, some American companies doing business in China are recognizing that their future there is short term if they don't completely abdicate to Chinese rules of enforcement. Talk to us about how that is not only a bludgeon to basically force U.S. companies to give up their American principles, but it's also becoming a very dangerous tool that those who are doing business within China are going to be sacrificing, their long-term capital, no longer being U.S. institutions, but really Chinese institutions that happen to operate in the United States.
So this is a really important point. And again, I'm happy to discuss in greater depth, but I think that we need to think about this on a couple of different levels. First of all, it's the role that individuals play. So individuals now post-COVID face significant checks on their ability to move. So COVID checks require you to share your passport number or your residence permit, your Chinese bank account number. So to be able to do anything, like be able to go into a cab or rent a scooter or purchase something, you have to be able to follow these checks and be able to submit yourself to this type of surveillance. So people who are working for those companies, both foreigners and Chinese people, in order to continue to exist within a Chinese context, have to follow follow the essentially most conservative versions of these rules in order to continue to operate. Now, one of the things in talking with people from the American Chamber of Commerce that's been very revealing is that in a lot of situations, it's not actually possible for companies to follow all Chinese laws at the same time. So they're inevitably violating some laws. So as a result, there's always the potential of a crackdown somewhere. And as we're seeing increasingly vague laws, so we just have this espionage law that came out on July 1st that apply to companies in addition to data security and oversight regulations. This increases the difficulty for companies to operate and to be able to operate legally. And I don't know what that looks like for the future and what types of decisions companies have to make in order to maintain their presence in the Chinese market. So I would say that this is an area where enhanced reporting requirements, particularly for Chinese investments, become really important so that at a very minimum, those decisions are more visible.
Professor Kugas, I think those are exceptional recommendations. The areas where I think this commission can be very effective too is holding the transparency. Look, this has got to be a team fight. We have the opportunity to stand for American principles with the U.S. government, with the American people. We also need our business and innovation sector to be on the same page because we are essentially allowing winners and losers to operate in this space, that those who decide to do the bid and will of the Chinese Communist Party get to have some sanctuary and therefore a market share, while those who hold to the same principles that they would operate in the United States are deprived of that. As a result, we're enfranchising the bad behavior of a few corporations who exploit humans, who torture individuals, who sacrifice American principles so that they can get a market advantage over those who are doing the right thing. I think transparency is a huge part of what this is. I thank the chairman for bringing this forward in a bipartisan way. I hope those companies have the opportunity to come here and justify their existence as well. Thank you very much, Val.
Thank you, Commissioner Nunn, so very much. Ms. Waxton, I think you're still online.
I'm still here. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good to see everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. This has been very, very enlightening very enlightening discussions. I'm really glad to have been here for it. I do want to ask you a couple of questions, Mr. Fish. Machine announced that it's engaged in independent audits now. Spot checks to address forced labor. Experts like Adrian Zenz have said that these audits would be inadequate if state-sponsored forced labor was in any way involved, as it creates a systematically coercive environment in which targeted groups mobilize through extensive government and grassroots recruitment efforts. With this environment in mind, what tactics have you seen companies like Shein take in hiding the source of materials mined, produced, or manufactured, either whole or in part, with Uyghur forced labor?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think that's an excellent question. You cannot do audits in China today anymore. It is not safe. You don't get concrete information, and you're putting often your Chinese staff in danger. So when you hire a company in China to go do an audit, you're sending someone to a plant and you're incentivizing them to lie. Because what if they go to a plant and they find forced labor, and they know that if they talk out about it, maybe they'll be in danger, or their families or their friends or their children. So there's no way to do it. And what we strongly recommend is using open source information, which you can do safely from outside of China, to paint very accurate pictures of links between corporations and various elements of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's a model that we ourselves take at the company I run, Strategy Risks. It's using open source information to tell the links between companies and the Chinese Communist Party. And we think that's incredibly important. It's also, as the information environment in China degrades, it's going to get more and more difficult for journalists, for policymakers, for companies, as Commissioner Nunn was saying, to get good concrete information from China. And so we need to understand that big data, AI, open source collection methods are going to be necessary for transparency.
Thank you very much for that answer. One other question. In your testimony, you said that we need to require corporations to disclose their exposures to China. But companies in their filings to the SEC often don't break out their China revenue, hiding behind broader categories like Asia. More information investors, regulators, and citizens have about how American companies are exposed in China, better. One of the reasons that I'll be reintroducing my Uyghur Forced Labor Disclosure Act, which passed in the 116th Congress with bipartisan support. A lot of my colleagues believe that issuers should only be required to disclose information that's material, and they already are obliged to disclose it, and they don't think that this is material. Please explain why it's important that, that corporations disclose their financial ties to China, including their supply chains,
That's an excellent point. It's, for so many companies, the most important market outside of the United States, and for some even more important than the United States. And so the idea that not giving a full picture on your most important market or one of your most important markets is just beyond me. I think another thing that companies do to hide behind this is they don't clarify whether or not when they say China, they're including Hong Kong or Macau or Taiwan. And so I think requiring clarity there as well is incredibly important, so that when companies say Greater China or China, what exactly are they saying? Because there's a real need for investors to make material decisions based on what their exposure is. So I applaud you, Congresswoman, for pushing on this issue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fish. And I would applaud you for your change of heart that you've had as you progress through your career. Please talk a little bit about how you came to that, how you came to the conclusion that you wanted to fight for good rather than be a part of the problem. If you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Thank you. I love that question. That's a fun one to answer. So I lived in Beijing for 6 years. I was a journalist, and it's hard to blame anything but naivete. So when you're living in Beijing, you think the way things are the way things are supposed to be. You bask in that environment. And it was only coming back to the States and seeing prominent Americans talk about China, not like Chinese people do, which is incredibly diverse and fascinating, but like the Communist Party. So they would say things like, China has 5,000 years of history, China only wants peace, China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and you wonder, why are they just repeating Chinese propaganda? And then I forced myself to go back and look at all the times that I did that, and all of the ways that I praised or facilitated the Communist Party. And it was a very uncomfortable transition, but I think it's really important for us to go through and see how we did this and just be very open-minded about these things. I do worry now a little bit about self-censorship in the other direction. I'm myself very anti-Communist Party, but there are legitimate reasons to support the party, and one has to be able to have a conversation about it. You know, I don't want us to be in a scenario where if someone says something nice about Beijing, they're automatically accused of being a Chinese spy or of being a toady or a lackey. I think we need to have a reasoned debate, and I applaud this commission for the way that it frames these issues and discusses these issues. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I want to acknowledge everything you guys have been through. I mean, it's true that a lot of you are still dealing with the effects of what your family is going through in China, here in the U.S., and I feel really bad for you about that. We're trying to make sure that we can do what we can to stop this transnational coercion. Thank you so much. And even Professor Kokos, I think that you too, even as somebody who may not be considered very interesting, I'm sure you feel very interesting to the Chinese Communist Party. So I would say, lock down all your devices, please. Thank you all so much for coming. It was really fascinating. Take care, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I'd like to now yield to Commissioner Wild.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And let me just commend the chairs of this commission and the staff who have put together an incredibly dynamic hearing with absolutely fascinating witnesses. So much of what we do here in Congress often goes unnoticed by the public, and part of that is just because it doesn't seem that interesting to the outside world. And we've all found that when we can make subjects interesting, people are more likely to listen, and thank you for helping us to do that. I'm honored to be a member of this commission. I just want to say a few things. First, Mr. Freedom, full disclosure, Sixers fan here. I think the last time you and I saw each other was in January of 2021. We were on a Zoom at the peak of COVID and talking about human rights and equal justice around the world. And I think at that time you weren't yet a United States citizen, and you are now one. So congratulations on that. I have to say you're a very good storyteller. You said a couple of times, I'm not a politician, and I suspect that there is a place for you in U.S. politics if you're interested, because you're so good at telling stories. You made the comment that human rights is about politics. You know, and you also very vividly illustrated that fighting for human rights can be lonely. It can be a lonely task. But what we've also seen through this hearing, and what we know if we just look around the world and look at different companies, is that fighting for human rights is sometimes at odds with the almighty dollar, or euro or lira, or whatever currency a company is dealing in, and the profits often transcend concern for human rights. And I think that's what this hearing is all about. It's sad, but I'm glad that we are having it. The only other thing I'll say about your comments, you made the comment that somebody in the Players Association said to you, if there's no NBA, there's no Players Association. I would suggest to the Players Association that they study the power of organized labor and what they have done in this country and elsewhere to really advance their rights. So with that said, Mr. Fish, I just want to comment on your what you said about the power of the consumer. We often have seen campaigns at grassroots levels against products, companies, and they don't start because somebody in Congress is talking about it. They start because there is an activist or a group of activists who are going out there and dispersing information, which of course is a little easier now with social media. And more power to them. Quite honestly, rather than Congress leading the way, what we often see is that governments, and I'll speak for Congress here, often take our direction from what consumers and the population are talking about and worried about and acting or advocating about. So I agree with you that the power of the consumer is huge. Dr. Kokas, let me just say, first of all, thank you for having your students read the terms of service, the TikTok terms of service. They might be the only people in the world who have, but I'm glad somebody did. Some lawyer or group of lawyers spent a lot of time on those terms of service, so it's nice that somebody read them. But you've made some really fascinating points in your testimony, and we've talked a lot about what companies are doing wrong, and I really do worry that often corporate America, or maybe corporations around the world, talk out of both sides of their mouth. They can condemn human rights abuses, but we have to have this relationship because it's critical to our profit margins. So, but what I'd like to do, just because we've talked a lot about the negative, is can you give us any examples of U.S. companies that have navigated these dynamics with China differently in a positive way, where they have, how they have navigated the PRC market and still done well, that have still been able to continue selling products in the world's largest markets while still standing up for their fundamental principles. Do any come to mind for you? And by the way, I open this up to anybody but you in particular, because you've studied it so much.
Thank you. I think that's a really important question. And one of the things that we've seen is that companies do the right thing when they face pressure most consistently.
Back to Mr. Fish's point, right?
Right, yeah. And this isn't just pressure internationally, but also pressures from their consumers. So the Top Gun case that I discussed, there was a huge outcry after Tom Cruise's bomber jacket had the Taiwan flag and the Japanese flag obscured, and then eventually Tencent pulled out. So there was less financial incentive for the film to move forward, making those statements. So I think really shining a light on things becomes really important, and that's one of the reasons why I have my students read the terms of service, so that at a very minimum they know what's happening. And that's why I think hearings like this are so important. And also transparent reporting requirements that are easy for consumers to read and that occur quarterly are the sort of things that companies have to respond to. Now, I would urge that there are already existing statutes in place, there are already existing reporting requirements that just could be tweaked. The other thing that I think is useful is to look at things like ESG indices that help to, and this isn't something that Congress would do, but it's something that Congress could support, where when we enhance reporting requirements, there's a way to actually financially reward companies that are involved in those particular indices. So I think Mr. Fish is ready to go, so I'll let him.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question. So we rank companies on their China exposure, and I can say with almost certainty that the company that has the lowest China exposure doesn't want people to know that. And I do hope with the new regulatory
Why is
environment.
that? Why do they not want people to know that?
Because some investor, some board member, some business tie they have will see that and then perhaps get angry and get upset. It's actually very fundamental with the NBA as well. So we did a big project with ESPN ranking NBA team owners on their China exposure. And we found that a lot of the pressure came not from the team itself, but from the owner. It's very similar with Hollywood too. It's not just that this film offended Beijing or kowtowed to Beijing. It's that someone involved with the making of the film or the parent company or the studio thought that this could jeopardize their business relationship. And so there's no, we rank on a scale from 0 to 100, and there's no 0. There's no company that has no exposure to China. I mean, we are in a very entwined world. We, in 2019, traded 25 times more with China than we did with Russia. The number is much higher now. And so where we are in this very messy process is we are decoupling, we are de-risking, we are moving in that direction so that hopefully in 6 months or a year, if tensions continue to go the way they're going, there will be companies that can stand up and proudly say, yes, I have removed my China exposure, and this makes me a healthier company, more responsible to my shareholders and to my consumers.
Well, thank you. It's interesting because there seems to be almost a knee-jerk reaction to made in China products. I will tell you, political candidates who have political swag, T-shirts, hats, whatever, and that are found to have a tag that says made in China, they're going to hear about it and it's going to become a negative hit on them. But so many people, I don't think, really understand the full cycle. So what a lot of consumers, voters, and other people in the US might be thinking about is we've outsourced so many things to China, we've lost market share, we've had factories closed down, including in my own district, Pennsylvania 7. Workers have lost their jobs. But without really thinking about the reason for that is not only that there are very low wages and lower costs of operating in China, but that comes at the expense of the people the Uyghurs, and the people who are producing these products in China. And that's the part that often people, I will tell you, and I don't fault anybody for this because it takes a lot of critical reading and thinking, and everybody's got things, but I think it's really important that we draw that full circle. And that it's not just about your factory closed and everybody lost their job, huge and very, very destructive to a community. And why did that happen? Well, because the Chinese can produce it more cheaply. And why can the Chinese produce it more cheaply? And that's really the question when we're talking about human rights that needs to be elevated and really needs to be talked about, not just that we're losing market share. As I said, I represented, or maybe I didn't say it, I represent a district where manufacturing is king. It is the largest sector of our economy, which I'm really happy to report because for a long time it wasn't. We lost Bethlehem Steel, which closed specifically because of steel being, Chinese steel. And really we were on a downward slide. We have come back. And quite honestly, the Chips and Science Act that was passed here is going to make a huge difference in manufacturing communities like mine, and of course we know that the Chinese waged a particularly high profile campaign on social media against the Chips and Science Act. And I think there's a reason for that. But I want to switch gears for just a minute let me just finish this line of questioning. As we talk about all of these things, we still have to acknowledge that we are very interconnected. As Secretary Yellen said on her visit to China, we seek to diversify, not decouple. I think that's a really important message, and people have to understand that. Can any of you speak to what more we can do as policymakers to assist businesses that want to invest fully here in the United States, but are reliant on doing business in the PRC, at least in the short run, for certain parts or processes? Because I hear about that a lot in my community. Things that cannot be made without things in the supply chain coming from China. How can we support those companies?
I'll answer that. There are things that can't be made outside of China, but there are plenty of things that can. And
But that takes ramp up. I mean, let's face it, we're seeing that right now with semiconductors. I mean, it's going to take a while to get to where we need to be. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
So no, I think that's an excellent point, and it does take ramp up, and it's good that we're starting now, or starting over the last couple of years. I think the issue is that so many American champions or American solutions also have large ties to China that aren't economically required. So we'll have to double check this, but I believe Mountain Pass, which is seen as the U.S. solution to the rare earths problem, is something like 7 or 8% owned by Chinese companies. And that's not the solution that the American people need. And it's not that this company needs that stake in order to survive. And so when we deal with companies on this all the time, when a company has, say, 1,200 factories in China, the idea isn't shut them all down. The idea is, okay, so of these factories, maybe 10 or 20% are both non-essential, but also very entangled with the Chinese Communist Party. And those are the ones that you get rid of first.
Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Just really quickly.
Sure.
One thing that I think is also useful is rewarding mitigation strategies. So one of the things that's, so shutting down a factory is more visible, but rewarding companies and working with companies to develop their mitigation strategies and honoring that ramp down time is really important, because it's not financially feasible in a lot of cases to shut things down.
I completely agree with you. I'd love to have another discussion at some point about the pragmatic approach to doing that, because I think you're absolutely right. But those are great words. We got to figure out how do we do that to support those. I want to switch now, if I may. Do I have a few more minutes? Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Ms. Ming Lee, and thank you so much for being here. And thank you for advocating for workers in the PRC as well as for your husband. You have a lot of courage, and you've spoken very powerfully. And the defense of universal human rights and dignity and fighting against the use of forced labor is just so incredibly important. Your husband, as we know, was arrested and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment in 2019 due to his activism, including defending workers from discrimination in the workplace. As you may have gleaned from my initial comments, I am a big fan of organized labor. I think that it serves a purpose. I think the Players Association should take some lessons from them. But so it's just critically important, because that is how an ordinary worker gains power, not alone, but collectively. And that's how it has to happen. And of course, we know that pro-worker advocacy is dangerous in the PRC because we don't have organized labor as we know it. There, we have the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which is government controlled and is the only legal organization that workers can join. Am I right? Yeah. Let me just ask you, I just want to express my solidarity. I hope that comes through for the sacrifices that you and your husband have endured. I hope that, have you been able to speak with him?
Not really. Actually, since he was arrested, I never have a chance to meet his lawyers. I was in China, so we finally came to the United States 2 years ago. But before that, I have like almost 2 years, and I went to the detention center and the court, and also go throughout the Chinese procedural law process. I went there 24 times, but never have a chance to visit him. And never have a chance to call him, never have a chance, even recently, my letters are still seized by the prison, and They just don't.
You're not
give
even,
the
you're not sure
letters.
he's even receiving them.
Yeah, they just don't give the letters to him. When my family members confirmed, I have sent several letters to him, and he said I didn't receive it. So even a photo, because when he was arrested, my girl was only 3-year-old, and they arrested him in front of my girl. The same day I was put into a Blackwood handcuffed and also integrated for overnight. Left my girl in the preschool, and they didn't allow me to pick up my girl. And so my girl now is 7-year-old. So almost 4 years, I really want to give him a photo. You know, as a father, and you really want to see your baby is growing. But even this very tiny, like requirement, and they just the Chinese government won't let him to get that photo. So this is why human rights is so important. I also work in the business area, and my job is to be the global e-commerce director, and I also run the supply chain director for 1 year. I know all of the the business area, but the point here is don't ask the company about the profit. Don't ask about the expense. Just ask them one question. As a human, where is human rights? If we don't have human rights, we lose freedom. So
Well, I think, I have to say, I think that is the
Yeah.
exact point of this commission.
yes,
I'm grateful that it was created and exists. The challenges, that's too soft a word, but what your husband has gone through, what you have gone through, what your daughter has gone through, highlight just how critical this situation is. And that's just one story. I'm sure there are many, many stories
yes.
like that. And of course, that suppresses any thoughts that other workers might have about collectively coming together to fight this kind of abuse. So thank you for telling this story.
you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
all for being
Congresswoman.
here. It's incredibly important, and I hope that one day we will be able to look back on this and see some improvement. I do believe that I've never believed that the solution is to just completely shun China. I agree with the secretary that diversify, not decouple and it's just a reality. But we also have to remember that there are many, many people there who are not the PRC. They just are residents, citizens of China, and they are not bad people. And that's something that often gets a message that gets lost too. So we just have to keep amplifying this, I really believe. But thank you all for really compelling testimony.
Thank you so
That I
much,
yield
Ms.
back.
Wild. Commissioner Wild, thank you so very much. And I too would agree with what my friend and colleague has just said about our argument is not with the people of China, it's with the oppressors. We stand with the oppressed, not the oppressors. And the Chinese Communist Party are the oppressors. So I thank all of you for your extraordinary testimony. If there's anything you would like to add before we end this hearing? If not, I would ask unanimous consent that Jim McGovern, our ranking member on the House side, that his comments be made a part of the record. Also, Sarah Cook, who is the senior advisor on China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan for Freedom House. Maya Mitalapova, who is the MIT Director of Human STEM Lab, that her testimony be included in the record. And Robbie Smith-Saunders from the Coalition for a Prosperous America, that testimony be a part of the record as well. I want to express my deepest thanks to Jenny Wang for her work on this hearing. Really deeply appreciate the leadership she has shown. Matt Squeri, Scott Flipsy, Piero Tazzi, our Chief of Staff for the China Commission, Diana Majsiowicz for her help as well. These hearings are, there are many, many witnesses who could be here. I think we've got the best of the best who have given us insights and information that is actionable, and I can't thank you enough for that. We will continue this series of corporate complicity by inviting the corporations themselves to be here. including Nike, the NBA Players Association, and others, of course, Milwaukee Tool. In the past, some have said yes, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, hopefully they'll all say yes, and hopefully they'll come to see that they can make an enormous difference. If the NBA, which is not hurting for money, we're talking about value added in terms of bucks and dollars that they make and players make. It is a very lucrative league without China. So my hope is that, the moral imperative that, again, Enes Kanter Freedom brings to a sharp point here at this hearing is heard by them. There are good players who I think want to do the right thing. Hopefully they'll be encouraged by your leadership to do so. So without any further ado, this hearing is adjourned. And again, I thank you.